is for the book Background Artist, The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong, and it shares the inspiring story of Tyrus Wong's remarkable 106-year life, from the paintings and fine art prints he made working for Roosevelt's WPA, Works Program Administration, to the unique handmade kites he designed and flew on the Santa Monica beach, showing how Tyrus found American communities that nurtured his artistic talent. Author Karen Fang will cover everything from Tyrus's work as a studio sketch artist for Warner Brothers to the best-selling Christmas cards he designed for Hallmark and other greeting card companies. I remember seeing a documentary about him, and I didn't remember the Hallmark cards. I think I blocked that out, but that's so cool. So Karen Fang, we're so pleased to have her here, is a film scholar and visual cultural critic who writes and speaks for museums and film festivals around the world. Known for her previous books about Hong Kong cinema and 19th century British interest in exotic objects, Karen often writes about the intersection of Eastern and Western aesthetics. Her work has appeared in many, many magazines, including the Smithsonian Magazine. She's also a prominent contributor to the Engines of Our Ingenuity, a long-running, widely distributed public radio series about science and innovation, where her episode always focuses on the visual arts. She's a Sunday painter, and her favorite media are watercolor and pen and ink. And Karen will be in conversation tonight with Lee Tang, a Vietnamese-American artist and storyteller with over 18 years in the animation industry. He started his career in animation at Lucasfilm Animation as a story artist, and from there moved on to such studios as Nickelodeon, DreamWorks, and Disney. He is currently at Pixar Animation Studios as a lead story artist, having worked on such films as Toy Story 4, Onward, Elemental, and Inside Out 2. So let's give them a warm welcome, Karen and Lee, please.
Thank you all for coming on a Friday evening when the weather's so nice. I'm coming from Houston where the weather's not nice. But also, it's really, another thing to be said about tonight is this is actually the official launch day of the book. The book just came out, it just became available in print. Thank you. A little over a week ago. And today was actually the official launch day, so thank you all for being here to celebrate with me. And the other thing that Indra, we were going to mention is whether or not you buy a book, I have some souvenir wristbands over there at the desk. So at the end of the evening, the wristband has a little motto from the book that is meaningful for when you read the book. And so please take a wristband, or as many as you'd like for anybody, for your family and friends as well. It says, always look up. So I'm going to start. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 8 of the book. If you know about Tyrus's story, he came in through Angel Island, and he was about 9 or 10 years old at the time. And because it was so difficult for children to come in, and for women especially, women were hardly ever there. If children came in, they were often on their own. And Tyrus's father had been in the U.S. for 20 years already, so he had established papers. And so although his father had gone back to China to bring him to the United States, his father was able to land, to disembark from the boat and re-enter the United States as a pre-investigated merchant. But his son Tyrus, who was entering the U.S. for the first time, had to undergo the interrogation and detainment process at Angel Island. So for he was a young child, 9 or 10 years old, and he ended up spending a month in Angel Island. For much of that time, really the only child in Angel Island during that time. And then subsequently, when he finally was landed, he and his father went to Sacramento. And so, although Tyrus would then eventually land in Los Angeles, where he spent the next 96 years of his life, it's still very much, Tyrus's story in many ways shares so much with so many other Chinese American families who came in through Angel Island as well. And so I wanted to start with this story, with this part of the book about his childhood, which takes place in San Francisco, in Sacramento. Chapter 8, Playing Hooky. Tyrus cocked his wrist and lifted his elbow above the paper, feeling the weight of the wet brush as he paused, imperceptibly, before abruptly dropping it down. Inky dark marks immediately welled up on the paper. Swiftly, Tyrus swept the bamboo handle from left to right, top to bottom, deftly shaping the elegant symmetry of Tai and adding special flair as he deepened the pressure before gracefully withdrawing the brush in the final upward stroke of Yao. When the words were finished, he lifted the brush immediately, being careful that no fluid dropped on the paper. He regarded the elegant, dramatic line. It wasn't easy, this art of Chinese calligraphy. Because ink and paper were expensive, his father, Look Get, saved old newspapers on which Tyrus practiced with water substituting for ink. They did so mostly to save money. Newspapers were cheap, water cost nothing, and once the water dried, the newspaper could be reused. But using fast-moving water and thin, quickly flooded newspaper also underscores the beauty and difficulty of Chinese ink painting. In this medium, unlike charcoal, oil paint, or many other Western art practices, erasure or painting over is impossible. A single mistake or stray drop can ruin the entire composition. Tyrus yawned and slouched in his chair, torn between the fascinations of the brush and the fatigue he felt after long days at American and Chinese school. It was late at night, and only a single bare bulb illuminated the paper, but the brush felt natural in his hand. Look Get stood behind him, just as he had done aboard ship when Tyrus was memorizing his coaching paper, ready to cuff him across the shoulders whenever he made a mistake. "What are you doing?" Look Get burst out when he saw his son making a move for bed. Tyrus was expected to finish at least one page of characters each night. "Get up! You do your lesson first." Where did Look Get find the energy to teach his son calligraphy at night? By the time he returned to Sacramento with Tyrus, Look Get was no longer affiliated with either of the two stores where his merchant papers claimed employment. Tyrus remembered only that his father found work fixing shoes, a job the boy soon realized his father was ill-suited for, as each night when Look Get came home, Tyrus could see his dad's hands all cut up from work. No doubt the hard work and possible shame that Look Get endured in the shoe shop informed his vigilance about his son's hands. Whether or not Tyrus became an artist, Look Get knew that he didn't want his son's hands to become rough and calloused with undeniable signs of hard labor. In Asia, calligraphy is traditionally a genteel pursuit practiced by scholars and aristocrats with literacy and leisure time. It must have been exhausting for Look Get to invest the time necessary to teach his son calligraphy after his long days in manual labor, but that is probably the point. Aside from reinforcing Tyrus's Chinese literacy, a skill Look Get may have doubted his easily distracted son was advancing in at school, calligraphy fostered an ethnic cultural pride despite an era of social forces determined to debase them. Look Get was a literary man whose fondness for quoting Chinese poetry belied his modest circumstances. He wasn't unusual. Contrary to contemporary assumptions about uncivilized, heathen Chinese laborers, by the time of Tyrus's arrival, strictures against Chinese immigration were so severe that most of the Chinese permitted to enter were literate, certainly far more so than many of the white European immigrants flooding in through Ellis Island. Whatever degrading or modest position these Chinese immigrants were forced to take, were they lucky enough to be granted US entry, calligraphy, as we've already noted, or as you know about the Angel Island poetry, was a means of maintaining dignity amid terrible circumstances. Calligraphy also capitalized on Tyrus's aesthetic gifts, the natural aptitude that Look Get hoped might offer his son a better life. Indeed, Tyrus wasn't the only Chinese-American boy of his generation for whom calligraphy was the groundwork for path-breaking careers in art and creativity. Within little more than a decade, after he graduated art school and was starting his career as an artist, Tyrus would meet Dong Kingman, Chi Chin S. Chung Lee, Key Luke, and George Chan, all Chinese-American contemporaries working in art and related creative fields, who also started studying calligraphy as children. For them, as for Tyrus, Chinese calligraphy was a means of cultivating early artistic interest while also refuting the daily degradations of exclusion by mastering a 1,000-year-old tradition. But the hard work and low pay began to wear on Look Gat. He made the difficult decision to leave Tyrus alone while he went elsewhere for work. After all they had been through to get Tyrus to the United States, it may seem odd that Look Gat would then leave his son on his own again. But Tyrus had already demonstrated his resilience, and at any rate, being free in Sacramento with school and peers would be nothing like forced confinement in Angel Island. So Look Gat arranged for his son to do small jobs in exchange for meals with a Chinese family that ran a grocery and a restaurant. Look Gat had already taught his son how to wash rice, how to wring out his washcloth, and to eat what food was placed before him. Then, after again admonishing Tyrus to stay in school, Look Gat took the train a full day south to Los Angeles, another growing California town with a significant Chinese population. Despite Look Gat's reminders to his son to stay out of trouble, the prejudices of the era caused trouble for Tyrus nonetheless. Once, when Tyrus and his friend Tyler went to the movies, the cashier at the ticket booth refused to let Tyrus follow his friend to the main seating. Unfazed by the glamour of Sacramento's Goddard Theater, the ornate movie palace where he and Tyler purchased tickets, Tyrus' response was indicative of the strength of character already apparent at Angel Island. "I want my money back," Tyrus spat, indignant that he couldn't join his friend. He tore up the ticket, threw the pieces on the counter, grabbed back his dime, and bolted before cashier or manager could catch up with him. Meanwhile, the same independence that buttressed Tyrus through Angel Island and incidents such as the Goddard Theater undermined his schooling, just as his father feared. "If I have to count to 20, Tyrus joked about his poor academics, "I have to take my shoes off." In arithmetic lessons and grammar class, Tyrus mostly daydreamed, if he was in class at all. Chinese school was no better, although sometimes he perked up when the instructor told stories from Chinese history and mythology. Long before Asian American student achievement became a trope of American culture, Tyrus knew he was different. Fishing and friends were just too big a distraction, particularly once parental surveillance was removed. "You're absent one day, you think fishing is pretty good. Then 2 days, then 3 days, then 4 days," Tyrus recalled. Eventually, he had to head back to school to collect his report card, only to discover, "I'd been absent for over a month. You can't say you had a stomachache for a whole month." His middle school teacher was a kind woman who saw past his indiscretions to appreciate Tyrus's liveliness and innate potential. "Tyrus, you are really a very, very bright boy," she said regretfully when she called him to her desk to confront him about his absences. The tears in her eyes caused young Tyrus a sharp pang of guilt. "But with a whole month missing, I can't pass you." The letter the teacher was required to send to his parent to inform him of Tyrus's failure reached Look Gat in Los Angeles, where he found someone who could translate the English. Whoever this was didn't mince words. "Ay-ya, your son is terrible," the man exclaimed, adding the uninvited, alarmist schadenfreude every child of Asian immigrant parents recognizes. "He couldn't get promoted because he is absent so much." News of Tyrus's absenteeism fell on Look Gat like a thunderclap. Immediately, he sent his son $20 for tickets and strict orders to board the next train to Los Angeles. Tyrus, always obedient when it came to his dad, packed his few belongings and followed. When he alighted on the platform, his father was there waiting. "Schwam!" went Look Gat's arm, slapping his son the moment Tyrus stepped off the train, even before Tyrus could greet his father. The blow was so strong that the flimsy suitcase Tyrus had packed in his rush to obey his father's command burst open, spilling his few socks and undergarments across the platform. "Just because I'm not in Sacramento to watch you, you play hooky," Look Gat raged. "Now you are going to stay here." Tyrus always retold the story with humor, laughingly miming his father's blow with animation. Gee, Oriental father, he thought to himself. He's very, very strict. But as an adult, he'd come to realize that he was actually a very good father whose strictness was for my own good. Look Get was just a frustrated parent, disappointed by his child and what Tyrus had done with the opportunities Look Get had worked so hard to make possible. As a child, Tyrus may have been undisciplined and mischievous, but he had a good heart and he readily admitted his faults. Later in life, Tyrus always regretted that he hadn't tried harder at school, even blaming his accent on his imperfect schooling. But the lightness with which he recalled his father's blows at the train station also shows his humility and perspective, knowing that life got him further than circumstances might have allowed. Moreover, while flunking out of middle school might have been an embarrassment, it also reunited him with his father, with whom he had spent so little time, his only parent and relation in America. Joining Look Get in Los Angeles would mean yet another readjustment to an urban, increasingly automobile-transformed metropolis, very different from the rich rivers and open fields of Sacramento. Back under his father's watchful eye, school and calligraphy would likely resume. But isn't this why he had come to the United States for? Isn't this what he had come to the United States for, and why his parents had sacrificed so much? If there is one thing Look Get imparted to Tyrus through calligraphy, it was that one must envision their next move before they act. Because in life, as in calligraphy, there are no redos.
Hi. Going through the book, right? It's an amazing book.
Thank you.
And it's a huge undertaking,
Yes.
right? But you chose, like, that you wrote about this man. What drew you to write about Tyrus?
So I really got interested in Tyrus in between 2016 and 2018, which I think when a lot of people started really learning about Tyrus. He passed away at the very end of 2016, and there was a ton of coverage of him. Because remember, it was right after the 2016 election, and this revelation, after all of the anti-immigrant sort of rhetoric that had happened during that time, to hear the story of someone who had endured terrible immigration story and then had this transformative impact in American visual culture, literally everybody's childhood, right, in making Bambi, was in itself such an amazing story that there was, and then of course the fact that he lived to 106. So there was, this incredible, there's so much coverage of him around 2016, and so the documentary about him had just come out earlier the year before, and so there was a lot of coverage. And then by 2018, I'd also been thinking about, like I think a lot of people following him as a film scholar, I was starting to realize I'd actually known about him for a while, that there was more and more sort of histories of Chinese in Hollywood, histories of Asians in animation, right? So that I was sort of starting to realize I've been coming across his name in different scholarly accounts. And then by 2018, if you remember, that was when the family separation at the border policy was taking place. And so that really sort of brought home again the significance of Tyrus's story, that it was 100 years later and it was basically the same. And so, there was the poignant story of like an immigrant contribution to America that I thought needed, that deserved, was fascinating and so compelling. But then at the same time, there was this incredible story about his incredible contribution to art, because beyond Bambi, there was 30 years at Warner Brothers. Before the movie studios, he was this prominent fine artist. And then to me, what was always the most interesting thing was the greeting cards. That in the middle of the 20th century, one of the nation's most recognized greeting card artists was this immigrant who was doing these Chinese-style Christmas cards that Americans were rushing out to buy these, orientalized Christmas cards, a sort of oxymoron. And so I thought as a scholar, there needed to be a story of like, the entire artistic practice, right? That for reasons of time, Pamela Tom wasn't able to do in the documentary. And so I started with, this question of like, what was the unifying theme in all of his artistic practice?
Yeah. And thank you for bringing his story wider to a wider audience and just going through the book again. I know more about him than I do myself at this point because it's so thorough. Like and no, like what I can glean from his personality, he didn't like talking about his life, right?
Yeah.
Like his daughters, and I relate to this. Like his daughters didn't know a lot about like what he went through. So how did you get so much about his life?
Yeah, this is so interesting because, and this is one of the sort of recurring themes in the book, is I sort of talk about, it seems like there was nothing to be told, but actually it was all there. And so, like, I think this is fundamentally the story of Asian American history, right? It's always the story of, like, visibility, invisibility. And exclusion alone, if you think about it, exclusion was designed to keep Chinese out, to keep them on the margins of society. And in order to do that, the U.S. government had to create this elaborate bureaucratic apparatus, which is surveilling Chinese at like every moment of transport at the border, like constantly registering them in every city that they are in the United States, or at least in the Western and Mountain states. And so, precisely because they don't want Chinese to be around, right? There's all this documentary evidence of their presence, and also documentary evidence of the U.S. practice of exclusion, right? And so, the cruelty of exclusion is that it makes it so many people don't know about it, right? Because there are not that many, Asians are still a very small portion of the population. Many people came in after 1965, so they weren't affected by exclusion. It's not taught in many schools, right? And so the cruel brilliance of exclusion is it makes it's so effective that people don't know about it. But actually, all the evidence is there. And so we just need to look for it, right? And then, so there's, and that story is true of any Asian American family who was here before exclusion or during exclusion, right? But Tyrus' story was particularly important because as an artist, there was all this other evidence, all this other representation, right? And then, and so like, working for the WPA, bureaucratic records, right? All of the studio records through Disney and Warner Brothers and Hallmark, right? He, as an artist, kept everything, as an artist and a person, because he was a pack rat. And the Wong family has, like, I would go through like unpaid bills or like receipts from like grocery things. Like he kept all his juvenilia, like, and I talk at the end of the book about stuff that we're still finding. And so, there, in a way, there was, you had to look for it, but actually it was all there. And so, and that was what was so wonderful, is that once you see it, like there's just so much evidence of this, of his incredible impact and everything that he did, right? And everything that he'd been through, even if he didn't want to talk about it.
That is so weird that his life had been tracked so much through all of it. Like governments, studios, even his own, like, I guess, I don't know if I'd call him a hoarder, but like just having his own stuff, he just left so much of his own like evidence of his life for you to just find and kind of sift through.
Yeah, and you think about these, now we record everything on our phones, but do we actually look at it? And like, well, if the phone dies or the cloud, blows up or something, like, are we going to have it or something like that? And so, the fact that it was on physical paper, right, was remarkable.
You're right. I'm going to keep everything I have. That's a good point.
For posterity.
For posterity. One day when you write a book about it. Well, what I really appreciate about the book was that it wasn't just about Tyrus. Like, it was a lot of stories. It was like his story as a Chinese immigrant wasn't necessarily unique to himself, but you also talked about the world around him. The world around him, like coming in as a little boy into the United States, not too far from here on Angel Island, and during Chinese exclusion. Like, could you talk a little bit about what life was like for him and people like him here coming during that time and just like living? And he lived so long, but so he saw a lot of changes. But like, what was that time for him like?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that Grant over there, who had sort of brilliant researcher of Chinese American history, had helped me. And I'm sure there's other people here in the audience who probably know more about this than I do. But I mean, if you came in under exclusion, right, you were an alien. If you made it in, you were an alien ineligible for citizenship, right? You had very limited rights. And that was if you got in, right? So you couldn't vote, you couldn't testify against a white person, you couldn't marry a white person, you couldn't own property, you couldn't lease anything, right?
Right.
Like you often, you had very little limited legal recourse, right? Often restricted to reside in very specific parts of town, right? And so, and it was, as many of you know, it was worse in California than almost any other part of the nation, because most Asians were here, right? and because Tyrus lived so long, what was so remarkable was that he really got to see the whole gamut of America's relationship to Asian America, right? So he'd come in under exclusion, right? And then he lived through the war, right? And so during World War II, right, there's this kind of like whiplash that happens for Chinese and Japanese Americans, where suddenly China's a U.S. ally, Japanese Americans who'd always sort of had a relatively slightly more privileged position vis-a-vis Chinese during the exclusion era, suddenly are seen as like these enemies. Many of Tyrus's friends, right, are sent off to the internment camps, and so he had been part of a vibrant Asian American peer group, right? And so the Chinese artists, right, suddenly get all of these commissions, right? There's all this interest in their artwork. That's a lot of the reasons why there was so much interest in the Christmas cards in the post-war period, right? But his Japanese American friends who he was so close to, right, their paintings were lost, never to be recovered, right? Like their careers were disrupted, right? Government commissions that they had, right, were suddenly taken away, right? Some of them sort of emotionally never recovered from internment, right? So, I mean, Tyrus experienced like literally sort of like everything.
That was an interesting part, hearing that, because he had to advertise, I'm Chinese. Yeah. That was a saving grace for him at that point in his life. Or like Chinese exclusion, like that helped him at that point, advertising to the world that he was Chinese, where in the past, it just negative recourse and impact all the time.
Right,
so
right.
To your point, he saw so much change throughout his life.
Yeah, so that's why there's sort of in the post-war period this sort of like moment where, if you were Chinese, and the U.S. relationship with China was actually sort of positive, and so there was all this sort of like consumer culture of Asia-Pacific aesthetics, right? And so he benefits from that. He starts decorating the ceramics. If you've seen his ceramics, right, with the hand-painted ceramics that were sold in like I Magnin, and what is the old upscale department store here in San Francisco? Gums, yeah. So it was sold in Gums.
Wow, everyone knew, right?
So, yeah.
So, working in animation, you kind of have an idea. Tyrus Wong, Bambi, right? And even talking to my colleagues, after knowing more about him, he was only on Bambi 3 years. Mm-hmm. The impact was so big that it just felt like it was more, right? That he'd been there at Disney a long time, but it was only 3 years. But he had such a diverse artistic career, like 30 years in Warner Brothers, doing live action, printmaking, fine art, public art, ceramics, cards. Those are such different creative worlds. But he was successful in all of them. What was it about him that he was able to traverse all these very different spaces and just perform so well?
Well, I mean, you're an artist. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's different. It's even when we talked back there, it's like commercial art and fine art have very different kind of thoughts and approaches and all that stuff. I guess for me, it almost sounded like he loved. It didn't sound like he had issue between commercial and fine art. He just liked to paint. Mm-hmm. He liked to create. And that was just my kind of takeaway from the impression of it. And that in and of itself just made him not snooty or elitist, right? Yeah. He just wanted to create. And I guess, that was kind of my perspective on why he was able to, because people can kind of understand that he just loved to create art, and then you kind of drawn to someone's genuine sincerity of just making art.
Yeah, I think 100% that I think for him the process was always the goal. Right, that the opportunity to create something, and one of the things that I really try to talk about is not just what we all recognize as art, whether it was fine art or commercial art, but he was making little toys for his for people that he'd meet. He would write these gag letters for his friends. Right at the end of his life, he didn't really use a cane until the last couple years, like after 100, kind of said, oh, maybe I need to use a cane or something. And then like when he was using a cane, he would actually like go out into his property and like find fallen branches and sand them down, and he would pick them specifically for the look of the wood. Like for Tyrus, everything was an opportunity for creativity, an opportunity for beauty, an opportunity to challenge your mind and to make something to make something better. Right, and so for him, like once you did that, then you moved on and you did something else, and which is a very different approach.
Like kite making.
The kite making, right?
He found kite making late in his life.
Yeah.
Like very late in his life.
Yeah.
Like he had such amazing kite inventions by the time.
Yeah.
One thing I like to think about is like he was such an accomplished person, right? But I truly believe like accomplished people don't do it alone. They don't do it alone. So, going through the book, he had a lot of support. And, like, his wife, Ruth, of 60 years, they're married for 60 years, she took on so much sacrifice for him. Like, she took care of the family, their daughters, their household, and even part of his, like, professional, like, correspondences and all that stuff. And just talk a little about the relationship, because I think it's so important to think about the people that also had to sacrifice for him to have accomplished everything that he did at the end of it.
Yeah. So Tyrus's wife Ruth is also in itself an amazing story, and so I keep on talking about like there's ways in which Tyrus's story is sort of like a typical Chinese American story, and then ways in which it's completely unique because of his artistic career. But Tyrus's wife Ruth is like also a very typical Chinese American story because her parents had both come before exclusion, and her mother was actually one of the first graduates, one of the first alumna of Cameron House. So her mother, Chinmui, was
out here, right?
Yeah, Cameron House in San Francisco, Chinatown. But she was there before it was even Cameron House. It was when the director was Margaret Culbertson. And so Ruth's parents, were highly assimilated because they had come to the U.S. very young. Ruth's mother, Chinmui, had grown up in Cameron House, where she had learned English. She was literate. She learned all these American skills. She was Christian, and then the family had eventually settled in Bakersfield. And in Bakersfield, the parents are now buried in the Pioneer Cemetery. They're not buried in the Chinese cemetery because that's how influential they were in Bakersfield. They were, and Bakersfield itself also has a very interesting sort of history. And so in Bakersfield, Ruth's family had run a large farm. And so Ruth had this experience of, growing up where her parents ran a business, right? They had people under their employ. They were all Christian. The parents were fluent in English, right? And then Ruth, actually, they met because Ruth came to Los Angeles to go to college, and she eventually studied English at UCLA. And so, there is this, this sort of, that you can see how they complemented each other, right? That like Ruth gave Tyrus sort of like ease is within the establishment community, right? And it's sort of obviously, right, when she was like writing the mottos for the Christmas cards and looking in the Bible for extracts or for scenes that he could develop for the content. But when you talk about sacrifice, I mean, every household, like it's a partnership, and somebody has to take care of the kids, somebody has to get food on the table, and she's doing that. But she also had very specific forms of sacrifice. So when we were talking earlier about the sort of restrictions on Chinese, up until like, when was it when there was it the Page Act that if a Chinese American citizen, an ethnic Chinese citizen of the U.S. married an alien ineligible for citizenship, which was often the case because they could only marry within their community, right? They would lose their citizenship. And so had Ruth and Tyrus married like a few years earlier, she actually would have lost her citizenship. But I think the law had changed just a few years before their marriage. So there's extraordinary sacrifice and risk that happens every time for all of these families.
This is kind of like a side note, like working at Pixar, where we have a wrap party at where we like finish the movie, we celebrate the movie, and we invite our family, and every party, the director or producers will talk at the beginning of the party. They always go, every party, go like, thank you for the families. We could have done it without you. Because it really is, you cannot do, like there's this nice narrative of like the lone kind of hero or whatever, but you really cannot do any of this stuff by yourself.
Yeah.
He, like, going through the book, he got so much support. People in his lives came in and out of his life. His father he rambled together $90 for him to go to art school, right? Which there's just from people in the community too, right? So I just love emphasizing that you don't really do it alone.
Yeah, and that's why, he never once, ever claimed that he was doing it alone, which is another reason why he didn't talk a lot about his life, because he was a modest man.
Yeah.
And he wasn't, I think so much, I think one of the reasons why, he sort of happily shifted to commercial art, because to succeed in fine art, you have to be a kind of big personality, and you have to really believe that you're the most important guy in the room, right? And that works if you're a Pollock or a Rothko or something, right? There's these contemporaries of Tyrus, but again, if you're an immigrant, you're not white, and you come in different circumstances, you sort of realize maybe those options are not less available for you, and but at the same time, there's an extraordinary world of opportunity that's not yet tapped, and Tyrus recognized that he had the ability to do that.
Yeah, even to your humility point in Pamela Tom's documentary, he says he's very old at this point. He says, I wasn't that talented. I was just lucky and worked really hard. I agree and don't agree. He was a very talented, but all that other stuff, working very hard and the luck and support of people, all it feels like it played into his success. What I want to talk about also is, so going through Tyrus's story, and there is a lot of parallels to kind of our modern day world, right? Then to the anti-Asian mentality that was going around, especially during pandemic, and also the current anti-immigration kind of thinking that's happening now. Thinking about Tyrus's life and our current state in the world, what are kind of your takeaways? What is, I guess I thought it was what is how do you frame progress compared to then and now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I try not to dwell on, because when you think about progress, change over time, and how far we are, have we made changes from where we were in the past? On some level, you kind of go that's not so good, So, but I mean, I do tell everybody this was absolutely the best project I've worked on in my career, and it was such an amazing experience for me, because no matter what was going on in my life, and like most people, we all experience challenges in our lives, and then of course, I was writing this during the pandemic, right, with all of the anti-Asian violence. It was also initially very difficult to get places booked with a publisher, because everybody would say oh, Asian American niche topic, I don't know how to sell it. Was and so, and all, there were all these points at which I could have gotten really discouraged or gotten really scared about what was happening in the world, or really sad for myself or for my kids or something like that. And then I would always think shame on you. Because look, this story better than almost anyone, and there's nothing that you're going through that's even comparable to what this guy went through. And then I also turned 50, while I was writing this book, and I was oh, poor me, I'm turning 50. And then I haven't even lived half this guy's life, So it was actually incredibly inspirational, and I feel everybody should just always, what would Tyrus do type thing, which is the point of the wristbands.
I think because my parents immigrated from Vietnam, right? And they don't talk about it a lot, and in the same way kind of Tyrus didn't talk about his life a lot. But the little glimpses of stories I get from trying to, escape there to come to the United States, I'm my life will never be that hard. Yeah, because of the things, I stood on the shoulders of people and them, right? And they did that, and my life is better for it, and it's different from it. And they did this incredibly scary, heroic thing, and then I'm well, that feels like progress. For me, I guess, as a culture. So that rang true with your feelings about going through Tyrus's book. I think it's Q&A time. Is that right? So it's Q&A time if anyone has a question.
So the family name, Ruth's maiden name was Kim, but her father's name was actually Kim. But of course, so his family name was actually ing, right? NG is like the pinyin or the spell, the transliteration. But of course, what always happens, right, is the first name gets transposed. And so by the time the family settled in Bakersfield, they had taken up the family name Kim. And then, and actually, parts of her generation, there were actually 10 siblings. And some of the siblings, by the time of the Korean War, began spelling their surname Kimm to differentiate themselves from Koreans. But if you can go to the Union Cemetery Pioneer section in Bakersfield, and you can see the gravestones for Eun Kim, Hong Kim, and Shin Moy. And there's also an excellent book called The Chinese of Kern County, in which Eleanor Kim, who was Ruth's sister, one of the Kim siblings, was very involved in the Chinese American community in Bakersfield, put that together with a bunch of oral histories and family documents and things.
Hello, my name's Jesse. My question is, for Tyrus Wong, I'm familiar with his documentary, so in the book, what do you expand upon from the documentary in your book?
Yeah,
Thank you.
so the documentary, for reasons of time, right? Pam worked on the Tyrus documentary for 17 years. She met him in the mid-90s. And, the problem, with documentaries, you always have to get all this information, and then you have to get funding, and then, when you're dealing with somebody who lived so long and did so many things, it's not an easy thing to get all of that content. And so eventually Pam had to make decisions about time, right? So the documentary, if you've seen it, it's like mostly focuses on immigration, Disney, and the kites. Right, and so there's sort of there's like a montage where you sort of see a couple of studio sketches, like the motion picture sketches, and you see like a scan, you just pan over some of the Christmas cards, right? And so that's why I was saying, as a scholar, I knew very early on that there needed to be a scholarly study of his entire artistic career, right? So I wanted to do that as a sort of visual culture historian, but of course you can't learn about Tyrus's life. And then, the fact that he lived 106 years is a story of America, right? It's because it's a story of the 20th century, right? And then, of course, he's such an amazing personality. And so, and I think books are different, right, from movies. Obviously, I'm a film scholar. I love, but books breathe in a way because they take a longer period of time and you're in your head, right? It's your intimate relationship you have with a book. And so, one of the things that I hope I do with the book is, not just sort of give you, go into the detail of the entire career and the entire life, but I think give you a chance to experience Tyrus, as he was over a longer period of time.
Yeah, the book expanded on everything. Essentially, it was like everything over the documentary, but it's true. Yeah.
Hi. Did Tyrus himself give interviews or talk about his work? I'm very interested about his role in Disney, particularly, I think, in the 30s. There was the anti-union movement. And I believe he also did the storyboards for Sam Peckinpah's Wild Bunch.
Yeah.
Which is a very...
We actually have one of those up here on the...
Yes.
Yeah.
Because The Wild Bunch was a very influential film on the Hong Kong action filmmaker John Woo.
Yes.
So it's kind of like round squaring the circle, if you could say, that a Chinese guy did the storyboards for Peckinpah, which then influenced, one of the great Hong Kong action directors. I was just curious about, his working methods and whether he talked about his relations with people that he was working with. Thank you.
Yeah. So going back to what Lee was saying about sort of where did you get all the stuff, right? And I was saying, actually, it was all there. You just had to find it, right? So in the book, one of the things I have in the back matter is a list of all of the interviews that I referenced. And it's not even all the interviews. I just decided, okay, these are the ones that are the most useful, the ones that I'm going to use and stuff like that. But, what was fascinating about Tyrus, because he lived so long and because he'd done so many things, that there were so many interviews with him, starting, of course, with his interview when he was a child coming through Angel Island, right? So people would interview him, starting in the late 1970s, people would interview him because he was one of the last living people who knew old Chinatown from Los Angeles, right? So like, it was kind of like they didn't even care whether he was an artist. Like they were just like, well, you remember that time. And so there were these oral histories then. Like, so in the 60s, there was a push by the government to interview all the surviving WPA artists. So there's a series, there's oral history, the Smithsonian Archives of American History did this oral history project, and so he was interviewed at that time, right? And then certainly by the 90s, when everybody's rediscovering him, that Disney does their own interview, and so there's a lot of interviews, and everything is sort of tweaked according to the interest of whoever's conducting the platform. You know, Tyrus's relationship to the strikes, and everyone wants to know about the Disney strike, the famous Disney animated strike in '42, which transformed the industry in the studio. He also was in the Warner Brothers Black Friday strike in 1945, which is absolutely transformative for Hollywood as well. And so, I mean, this is like this other thing that, like, it's just like he ends up like, it's like, where's Waldo? He ends up like in every part of American history.
It's like Forrest Gump. It's like
yeah,
Forrest
exactly.
Gump.
It's like Forrest Gump,
He's Forrest Gump.
right?
Yeah.
You know, and so he's in the Warner Brothers strike, you know, and so the famous thing in the Disney strike is, you know, if you know the Disney strike, like everybody's agitating for better working conditions. Disney, you know, at this point, every other animation studio has buckled, right, to the general impact of the unions during the 30s, and Walt just digs his heels in and says, I'm not going to do it because I can't, right, and Tyrus is working on Bambi, and he thinks he has a pretty good gig, and he's like, well, I don't want to rock the boat. And he stays inside, he doesn't walk the picket line, and he still gets cashiered, because at that time, Walt just decides he has the opportunity for belt tightening, right? Ironically, 3 years later at Warner Brothers, it's the reverse. Be at Warner Brothers was a union studio. Everybody had to be a member of the union, and once you were hired. So as soon as he got his job at Warner Brothers, he had to sign on with the IATSE, which is a union for like motion picture artists, among other things. And so when the strike breaks out at Warner Brothers, he's actually forced by the union to go out on the picket lines. And then it ends up in jail with Herb Sorrell, the head of the strike. So like, you know, so he talks about this, he talks about them, you know, but, you know, typical Tyrus, the stories are always sort of like, oh, like he has this really funny story, which is in the book, about like what Sorrell tells him to do while they're in jail and stuff. But, you know, Tyrus was always very clear that like he was just really trying to get by. He had to protect, you know, the reason why he went to Disney in the first place was they were expecting their first child, right? Like, and remember that when he was at Disney, he was still an alien, and every time he would have to read every census, every time he moved residence, every time he wanted to, you know, do anything, he would have to fill out this alien form that said, and one of the questions that you would get asked on this alien form was like, I can't remember the wording, it's in the book, like, have you recently been involved in any like countercultural political activity? So obviously he's not gonna say yes, you know, on that. So he was always just, you know, always trying to do whatever was not going to get him in trouble, which I think is what most immigrants are gonna do in that situation.
I have a question. Hi. You mentioned sort of just in passing of the sort of comparison of life to his life that briefly that the publisher was sort of characterizing this as a niche Asian story and is like, who's going to buy that, or how can we sell it, or whatever. And so I'm really curious how that was overcome, and why, or I guess I'm trying to think of how to word it, but since he is sort of the Forrest Gump of Hollywood, and I mean, how does his story get out, or why isn't it celebrated by a larger Hollywood audience? Why is it still considered a niche Asian story?
The short answer is because publishing is the oldest media form. It's like the most antiquated. So like, you know, so, you know, I mean, Pamela Tam, after she did the Tyrus documentary, like, then there was a children's book, Paper Sun, which came out, was illustrated by
Chris Sasaki.
yeah, a
He used
Pixar
to work
artist.
at Pixar, yeah.
And Pamela Tom, after she'd done the documentary, all these other people came to her and said like, oh, you want to do this other movie and stuff like that. But publishing is just a really old media form, and so most books don't make their money back, right? Asian Americans, like there's this weird sort of like accounting that happens. So like apparently, Asian Americans are like some of the most highly educated, right? Racial ethnic group in the United States, right? The highest disposable income, right? We're also apparently often actually high level book buyers, but for some reason the publishing industry doesn't register that, and so they would always just say it was a niche story, and that they couldn't count on Asian American buyers to buy the book, and I would be like, but it's Disney, Warner Brothers, Hallmark. Like, it's not even about Asian American. Like, I mean, do you know? Like, I mean, Hallmark is like, it's like the, I mean, Disney. I think at the time, like they were, reopening the theme parks. Like, Hallmark is like one of the most successful like revenue like cable channels, right? There's literally, and I'm sure many of you who are Asian American, you've probably had that experience of like, if you're Asian American, you're speaking with an American accent, like people look at you and they still think they're hearing an accent or something. And I felt like selling the book was like the same problem, so.
Congratulations still. It sounds even more complicated to get out into the world. Congratulations
Thank
getting
you.
out in the world.
Thanks.
I saw a question over here. Was it?
Hi. So if you had to pick like two parts of the book that you had to preserve, and it's like your absolute favorite, what would those two be?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear you very well.
Oh, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. If you had to pick like two parts of the book that you absolutely love and had to preserve, what would those two parts be?
Of my book?
Yes.
It's like picking your favorite children.
I know, I can't do that because it changes every day. Like, I don't know. I mean, it was funny because I'm also a teacher, right? Like my day job is as a faculty member, and so I knew that I knew like sort of strategically it was important to make sure that chapters are sort of self-contained, because I knew that like teachers are going to take an art historian is going to take like the chapter on the greeting cards. Or the chapter on the WPA, and that like a film scholar is going to just take the chapter on Warner Brothers or the chapter on Disney or something like that. And then the Asian American Studies history classes are just going to use like the early chapters on on exclusion or immigration. So I sort of knew that I needed to sort of like write them in relatively self-contained chapters, even though there's like these threads that arc through the entire narrative. And so, I don't know. I mean, I was telling Lee before we all started, like, I right now I'm listening to the audio files for the audiobook, which will come out in a few weeks, and they're narrated by the Chinese American narrator Caroline McLaughlin, who's excellent. And I'm like telling myself like, oh my God, like the book sounds even better now that she's narrated and stuff. And so like, I mean, I do feel like it's like which story is most meaningful to you in your life, or what's most meaningful to you at this time, right? Because sometimes like it's fun for me to like think about like the whole model minority chapter and the ways in which Tyrus like challenges that category, right? But then of course like, I mean, I loved telling the Warner Brothers story, because motion picture sketch art is like a thing a lot of people don't really understand as a practice. And I mean, actually, like we should talk about what it means to be a story artist in animation, because that's what Lee does. And like people always think that Tyrus was an animator, but he wasn't an animator. He was a concept artist, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about?
Just like with a sketch artist, people don't know what a story artist does either. I've tried to explain to my parents like a million times, and they're like, "Oh, did you draw this?" I'm like, "Well, it's not technically drawing, but it's a thing." It's like doing. There's a lot of people involved in making animated movies, like hundreds of people, right? All across the board, creative, production, etc. And we tend to get grouped into like the term animator, which is, to clarify, it's just one kind of creative job in the production of an animated movie. So for Tyrus, he was sketch artist, so he captured just kind of visual kind of vibes of the movie and kind of like helped, just try to represent feelings and emotions that could insert themselves into the movie, and it contributes to the overall story and the overall movie in a very like emotional, kind of ethereal way. Then for me as a story artist, what we do is we help create the story, like the shaping of the story, like the characters and what they go through and kind of themes of the movie and all that stuff, and we help shape that, and so it's kind of like helping write the story, but again, it's a lot of people's jobs to kind of help write the story. Then from then on, we kind of draw out the story in a rough way, which is kind of like a blueprint for the movie. And we do this for years. We do this for years where we're like, maybe the character does this. So I worked on Inside Out 2, which just came out, and you talk forever about like what is the main character's joy? What is Joy going through? Like what problems emotionally is she going through? What obstacles is she encountering during this movie? And that's so much what our job is trying to like figure out characters, create the ideas of the movie. So my parents didn't understand that either. So I don't know how many people here understand it, but and we take years to do these things, like 5 years. 5 years to make an animated movie. People think, oh, this is 5 years? And it costs like hundreds of millions of dollars at Pixar, and it's all surprising to people what it actually is like doing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, we all love movies, like movie magic, all that stuff, but like a lot of times people, like they think they understand it and they don't, right? Like they don't understand like how belabored animation is. And with live action, like people don't understand like how much like happens by those people whose names just sort of go by at the end of the end credits, right? Like, at the Oscars, right, we think of like the director or it's like the producer who gets to stand up to take the award for Best Picture, right? And you don't think about all these people who are like, drawing like motion picture sketches so that the costume designer can figure out like, how the costume like integrates into the set, so that the cameraman can figure out like where, how much stuff is going to be, within the frame, right? Like they're going to figure out like how many people they can get into a composition or something like that. What's the mood, the vibe, as Lee calls it. That's what the motion picture sketch artists do. And like nobody ever thinks about these people, right? And it's also just sort of a love letter to what the old movie studios used to be like, right, in the golden age of this studio system. And so, like, I mean, to go back to your original question about just like which chapters are my favorite, I don't have a favorite, but one of the things I'm really proud of is the Warner Brothers chapter, because it really gives you a sense of what it was like in that era when you could get a job in the studio and like, and it was, you knew that people were never going to think about your name like in the Oscars or anything like that, and yet it was actually this really rewarding and actually like an upwardly mobile job as well.
Yeah, again, to that point, my earlier point, these movies, they celebrate like the director, but you sit through the credits, there's so many people involved in making these things. And that movie could not exist without all those people.
Last question.
Hi. So it sounds like he really lived and breathed art throughout his life. So I'm curious, during his commercial career, if he had much time to do personal art on the side, and also if he had other hobbies and interests, and if his personal art, how it compared to his commercial art.
Great question. So he never stopped doing like fine art. So, while he was at the studios, he was still like entering stuff into competitions. Like he was still placing fine art paintings in museums. The Los Angeles County Museum has paintings that like they purchased in the 50s. So he always continued doing fine art. It was just a sort of like the relative time or the proportion of his output, obviously, once you're in the studios, because in the studios, like you're pushing out, or you're doing commercial art, you're pushing out so much stuff every day.
Yes.
Right? Somebody else has described it to me as like you're just standing at an incinerator, just shoveling stuff, and so
Yes.
And so, but but Tyrus was still doing fine art. But the other thing to think about is like, remember, he was always a work on paper artist, right? Which is a specific phrase in fine art. So works on paper means like you're doing watercolor, you're doing pen and ink, you're drawing, right? And in the Western tradition, works on paper is not usually considered as like important as easel painting, right? Easel painting is oil painting, it's the genres of like history painting, landscape painting, right? Portraiture, stuff like that. So the problem is if you're coming from the Eastern tradition, right, of calligraphy, of watercolor, of painting on silk, right, by the very conventions of the cultural tradition, when it's imported to the West, it looks like a sort of like lesser form. It's decorative, not serious and important and fine art, right? And if that's what you like, right, if that's what you're best at doing, and actually Tyrus was not like better at watercolor. Like if you see his oil paintings that he did in art school in the very early part of the 30s, he did these beautiful oil paintings like Chinese Jesus, which for many years was here in San Francisco, right, is an oil painting. But watercolor was I think Tyrus's like favorite medium because it was fast, because you get this luminosity and this transparency of color, and because the immediacy of the line that you get with watercolor, because you can't redo, right, is so authentic and so intimate, right? That was always so meaningful for him, right? And so when you're always doing that, and it's never going, it always has a different place historically in the Western tradition. But I think his genius was to say very early on that he wasn't going to internalize that hierarchy.
Well, I think we've come to the end, although this is so fascinating. I feel like it could go on all night. Let's thank Karen and Lee, please. Thank you. Thank you. Oh.